The morning I stood in the self-checkout line at the superstore on Wonderland Road, watching the screen flash declined in red letters for the third time, was the morning everything changed. I wasn't buying anything extravagant. A bag of brown rice, 2 cans of diced tomatoes, a box of chamomile tea, $41.17. The woman behind me shifted her weight. I could feel her impatience without even turning around. I mumbled something about the chip reader being finicky and switched to another card. That one was declined too. I left without the groceries. I walked to my car in the November cold, sat in the driver's seat, and did not cry. I had forgotten how. My name is Vivienne Marchand, and I am 68 years old. I lived in a brick house in London, Ontario, the kind of house with a front porch and a Japanese maple in the yard that turns the color of embers every October. I was married for 39 years to a man named Douglas. He retired from his accounting firm 4 years before I did, and somewhere in those 4 years, while I was still commuting to the school board office where I worked as an administrative coordinator, something shifted in our house. Something quiet and irreversible, the way a foundation settles, you don't notice it until you see the crack in the wall. It did not happen all at once. That is the first thing I want you to understand, because when I tell people parts of this story, they always say, "Why didn't you just leave?" And I want them to understand that there was no single moment where a door slammed and a lock clicked, and I knew I was trapped. It was more like standing in a lake and not realizing the water was rising. By the time it reached your chin, you had forgotten what dry ground felt like. It started with what Douglas called simplifying. He retired in the spring, and by summer he had begun paying more attention to our finances than he ever had during his working years. This surprised me at first, then pleased me. He had always been the one who handled investments. I managed the household accounts, paid the bills, kept track of what we spent on groceries and utilities, and the grandchildren's birthday gifts. We had separate checking accounts and a joint savings account. It had worked for nearly 4 decades. "We're duplicating fees," he told me one evening, setting a spreadsheet on the kitchen table. He had color-coded it, 2 sets of monthly fees, 2 sets of overdraft protection costs. "It doesn't make sense now that we're both home." He suggested we consolidate into one joint checking account. He would manage it, he said, because he had more time and more experience with financial planning. I could have a supplementary card. "It'll be simpler," he said, "cleaner." I thought it sounded reasonable. I want to be very clear about something, because the top comments on videos like mine always point this out, and they are correct. In Canada, no one can close a bank account that belongs solely to you. Not your spouse, not anyone. A bank account in your name alone is your legal property. If Douglas had tried to close my personal account without my signature and presence, the bank would have refused. What he did instead was more subtle. He didn't close my account. He convinced me to close it myself. He brought the forms. He drove me to the TD branch on Wellington Road. He sat beside me at the desk while I signed. The account manager, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, slid the papers toward me and I signed them. Douglas smiled. He said, "Good. This is going to be so much easier." I believed him. I had believed him for 39 years. The supplementary card was in my name, but the account was his. Every transaction appeared on statements that went to his email, which he managed on his laptop. The laptop he kept in his home office, the door of which he usually kept closed. For the first few months, it was fine. I used the card for groceries, for gas, for the small things. If I wanted to buy something beyond the usual, a birthday gift for our daughter, new shoes because mine had worn through at the heel, I mentioned it to Douglas, and he said yes, or he said, "Do you really need that right now?" Sometimes I bought it anyway. Sometimes I didn't. By the second year, I had stopped buying things without mentioning them first. I told myself it was a habit I had developed, a courtesy. I did not examine it too closely. By the 3rd year, Douglas was reviewing the statements with me at the kitchen table on the 1st of every month. He would go through each transaction with his reading glasses on and his coffee going cold beside him, and he would ask me to account for things I had bought. Not accusations questions. What was this $43 at Chapters? Who's Karen Belisle, and why did you take her to lunch? You went to a cafe on a Tuesday morning? You didn't mention you were going out. I found myself pre-explaining things before I did them. I would come to the kitchen and say, I'm thinking of driving to the garden center this afternoon. They have perennials on sale. He would nod or not nod, and I would adjust my plans accordingly. I told myself this was communication. I told myself this was what retired couples did. They kept each other informed. Karen, my closest friend since our daughters were in the same kindergarten class at Northridge Public School, noticed before I did. We were walking the trail along the Thames one April morning, and she said, "You used to call me spontaneously. Now you always text first to see if it's a good day. Why do you need to check?" I told her Douglas liked to know my schedule. She looked at me for a long moment and said nothing. By the time I stood in the Superstore parking lot in November with my declined card and my bag of groceries left at the register, Douglas had implemented what he called an allowance structure. He said the word allowance without any apparent irony. He had determined that my personal spending, anything that wasn't household necessities, should be budgeted at $80 a month. $80. I am a 68-year-old woman with a university degree and 31 years of pension contributions and a house that was half mine, and my husband had decided that $80 a month was sufficient for my personal needs. When the Superstore card was declined, it was because I had spent $77 of those $80 earlier in the month, and he had noticed. He had reduced the available balance on the supplementary card without telling me. I discovered this when I called the bank from my car. The representative explained it to me carefully. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in that parking lot for 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard. The Japanese maple in our front yard had already lost its leaves by then. Everything looked gray. The question people always ask is, why didn't you just open a new account? Direct your pension and your CPP into it? And this is the question that requires the longest answer, because the answer lives inside what the counselors I would later meet called coercive control. And coercive control is not about locked doors. It is about what happens inside your own mind after years of being managed. By the time Douglas had reduced my card limit without telling me, I had already stopped thinking of my pension as mine. I had stopped thinking of myself as someone with financial authority. He reviewed our finances. He managed our money. I was the one who asked. This was not something that happened to me from the outside. It was something that had been carefully constructed inside me, one small accommodation at a time, over 3 years of spreadsheets and monthly reviews and questions asked in a tone of voice that was never quite angry, but always just slightly disappointed. I am not stupid. I want to be clear about that too. I managed a department of 14 people for 11 years. I planned and executed a full office relocation for the school board in 2009, on time and under budget. I am not a woman who lacks capacity. I am a woman who was slowly, methodically persuaded that her own judgment could not be trusted. The pharmacist's name was Patricia Osei. She worked at the Shoppers Drug Mart on Fanshawe Park Road, and I had been going to that pharmacy for 11 years. She knew my name. She knew my medications. She was the one who called me in October to say my lisinopril prescription was ready for pickup, and she was the one standing at the counter when I came in 2 weeks later than I should have. "Mrs. Marchand," she said, "this was ready at the beginning of the month." She said it gently, not as a reprimand. I told her I had been busy. She looked at me the way people look at you when they can see something you are working very hard to hide. "Are you doing all right?" she said. I said yes. I paid for the prescription with my supplementary card, which had a balance left because it was the 3rd of the month and I hadn't spent anything yet. I put the paper bag in my purse. I thanked her. I started to leave. "Vivienne," she said. She had never called me by my first name before. "We have a community liaison who comes in on Thursdays. She works with a women's support program through the city. She leaves cards at the counter. I don't know if that's relevant to you, but I want you to know it's there." I did not turn around. I said thank you to the door and walked through it. I cried in the car that time, not for long. I didn't fully understand why I was crying. I told myself it was stress, the holidays coming, the gray November sky. But something had shifted. I started paying attention in a different way. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to notice. The way Douglas asked where I was going before I had my coat on, every single time, without exception. The way he tracked my mileage, he had started noting the odometer when I left and when I returned, not confrontationally, just a small notation in a notebook he kept by the garage door. The way he had stopped asking Karen for dinner 3 years ago and had never resumed, and how I had stopped suggesting it because the answer was always a reason why the timing wasn't right. The way he spoke to me in front of his brother at Thanksgiving, correcting me mid-sentence, gently, always gently, in a tone that implied my version of events was charmingly inaccurate. I took one of Patricia's cards the following Thursday. I waited until I was sure I was alone in the aisle before I picked it up. I put it in the interior pocket of my purse, behind my health card. The woman's name was Anita. She worked for a program called Community Connections through the City of London, and she met with women at the pharmacy, at the library, at a church hall on Commissioners Road. I texted the number on the card from my phone on a Thursday afternoon when Douglas was at his weekly lunch with his former colleagues from the firm. I deleted the message immediately after I sent it. We met at the Central Library on Dundas Street the following week. I told Douglas I was returning books. I had 3 of them in my bag. It was not a lie. I was becoming very careful about what counted as a lie and what counted as simply not volunteering information. Anita was a small woman, younger than I expected, with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She bought us both tea from the little cafe near the entrance, and we sat at a table near the window, and she let me talk for an hour without interrupting me once. At the end of the hour, she said, "What you're describing is financial abuse, Vivienne, and it doesn't require bruises. It doesn't require shouting. It is one of the most common forms of coercive control in long-term marriages, and it is recognized under Canadian law." I held my cup of tea and said nothing. "You have independent rights to your pension income," she said. "Your CPP, any asset that was accumulated during the marriage, is subject to equalization under Ontario's Family Law Act. He cannot legally prevent you from opening your own account. He cannot prevent you from redirecting your income. And what he has done with the supplementary card, limiting your access without disclosure, that's a form of economic abuse." I had not heard the word abuse applied to anything in my marriage before that day. I had heard difficult. I had heard complicated. I had heard he means well. I had never heard abuse. "I need you to understand something," Anita said. "You have not done anything wrong. You have been managed by someone who is very good at making management feel like care." I went home and made dinner and said nothing. Douglas told me about his lunch. I listened and nodded and passed the bread. I was building something in the back of my mind, the way you build a room quietly, one wall at a time, in the dark. I opened a new checking account at the Scotiabank on Richmond Street the following Monday, when Douglas was at his Tuesday morning golf in the before-Christmas session he attended at the indoor facility in Lambeth. I had the wrong day. First, I mixed up my own schedule. I was that unaccustomed to acting without informing him. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I drove home. I went back on Monday instead. The account representative was a woman named Giselle, and she asked me no questions about why I was opening an account without my spouse. She was professional and efficient and had me set up within 40 minutes. I redirected my pension from the school board and my CPP to the new account that afternoon, using my phone in the library parking lot through the government's online portal. It took 11 minutes. I had been afraid it would be complicated. It was not. I want you to hear this clearly. Your income is yours. Your CPP, your OAS, your workplace pension, these are yours by law. No one needs to co-sign that redirect. No one needs to approve it. I am telling you this because I wish someone had told me years earlier, when the water was still at my knees. I told no one. Not Karen, not my daughter Renee, who lives in Ottawa with her husband and our 2 grandchildren. I love Renee completely, and I knew that if I told her, she would call. And if she called, Douglas would know something had changed. So I kept it in that quiet room I was building. I added walls. Anita connected me with a woman named Deb, who ran a support group for women over 50 at the church on Commissioners Road. I told Douglas I had joined a book club. It was a Thursday evening. He asked which book. I had thought of that. I said Elizabeth Strout's new one. He nodded. He was watching something on television. He did not look up. The women in that group, I want to tell you about them, because they were the architecture of my courage. There was a woman who had left after 44 years and was 62 and living in a one-bedroom apartment near Victoria Hospital and described it as the first place she had ever chosen for herself. There was a woman still in her marriage who came every week and took notes and said nothing, but whose hands had stopped shaking by December. There was a woman who was a retired nurse and had seen things in emergency rooms that she would not describe in detail but said had made her recognize something in her own home that she was only now naming. None of us were dramatic. None of us had dramatic stories in the way that word usually implies. There were no black eyes to account for, no whiskey bottles, no screaming matches the neighbors could hear. What we had were decades of small diminishments, carefully administered by men who told us they were taking care of us. I gave myself until March. I had a reason our lease on the storage unit, which was in my name, expired in March, and renewing or not renewing, it would require a decision, and decisions had a way of becoming conversations with Douglas, and I did not want a conversation. I wanted to be gone before any conversation became necessary. I was methodical in a way I had never allowed myself to be, because methodical required confidence, and confidence required believing that my own judgment was sound. I was learning to believe that again. I moved small things out slowly. Winter clothes I didn't wear anymore, to the storage unit first, then to Anita's office, my grandmother's silver hairbrush, the box of photographs from before we were married, my photos, my past, my university transcripts, which I had kept in a file folder in the spare room for reasons I had never questioned, as if they were documents I might need to prove something one day. I took them in January, in a tote bag, with a recycled grocery bag over top. I told Douglas I was dropping off donations at the Salvation Army on Warncliffe. I brought 2 bags of old towels. It was not a lie. I found an apartment. This was the most frightening part, not because Douglas would know, but because I had not rented an apartment since 1981, and the world had changed substantially. Anita helped me. I had enough in the new account by February. My pension and CPP had been redirecting for 3 months. I had not spent much. I had become very good at not spending much. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building near the parks on Wortley Road in Old South, a neighborhood I had always loved and never suggested we move to because Douglas wanted the East End and I had accommodated that as I had accommodated most things. The lease was in my name. The damage deposit was paid on a Thursday afternoon. I did not tell a single person except Anita and Deb. I gave myself a date. A Wednesday in March, when Douglas had a full-day appointment at the specialist's office in Toronto, a cardiac follow-up that required him to be gone by 6 in the morning and would keep him occupied and out of the city until at least 4 in the afternoon. I had known about this appointment for 6 weeks. I had marked nothing in the calendar. I had kept it in the quiet room. The night before, I slept well. I do not fully understand why, but I did. I think perhaps because the decision had already been made at some earlier point, and the body knows before the mind admits it. I was up at 5. I moved through the house in the dark. I had packed most of what I was taking over the previous 3 weeks in small increments, the bags going into the trunk of my car at times when Douglas was occupied indoors. I did not take the furniture. I did not take the good china or the artwork or the things that were genuinely ours together. I took my clothes, my books, my files, the photograph of my mother on her wedding day, the small oil painting of Georgian Bay that had been a gift to me from a friend and that Douglas had hung in the hallway in a spot where I could rarely see it. I took the painting off the wall at 5:40 in the morning and stood for a moment in the hallway with it under my arm. The house was very quiet. The street outside was not yet light. I had written a letter. Not an explanation. I did not owe an explanation, Anita had said, and I had come to believe her, but a factual statement. I was leaving the marriage. I had retained a family lawyer, a woman named Rachel Fournier, whose office was on King Street, whom I had met twice already. I had included Rachel's contact information. I had said nothing about where I was going. I left the letter on the kitchen counter under the salt shaker. Then I picked up my bag, walked through the house for the last time, and closed the front door. He called 38 times before noon. I watched the number on my phone and let it ring. At 12:15, I set the phone on the kitchen table in my new apartment. My own kitchen table, small and secondhand, purchased the previous week and delivered while Douglas thought I was at the library, and I made myself a cup of tea and looked out the window at the bare March trees in the park across the street, and I breathed. The 39th call came at 12:40. I did not answer that one either. Then I called Rachel and told her he had begun attempting contact, as we had discussed, and she advised me on next steps. I want to tell you what the apartment looks like because I think it matters. It is not large. It is 680 square feet on the 3rd floor, with a window in the living room that faces west. In the late afternoons, especially now as spring is coming, the light comes through that window in long horizontal bars and falls across the floor and the second-hand couch and the small bookshelf I assembled myself, badly, with the wrong screwdriver, and then correctly, once I found the right one. There are no spreadsheets on my kitchen table. There is no one who needs to know where I am going before I put on my coat. Renee cried when I told her, not from sadness, or not only she said she had been waiting for me to say something for 2 years, that she had noticed, that she had not known how to ask, that she was sorry she hadn't pushed harder. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I meant it. The person managing a coercive situation becomes very skilled at making it look like everything is fine. That is part of the mechanism. It is not the observer's fault for believing what they are shown. Karen came down from her house on a Saturday in April, and we walked along the Thames all the way to Springbank Park, the way we used to. She brought Tim Hortons. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about her life, too, not only mine. I had forgotten, somewhere in the years of Douglas, that other people's lives were interesting and worth being curious about. I am not going to tell you the divorce has been easy. It has not. Douglas hired a lawyer from a firm that specializes in drawing out proceedings, which Rachel told me to expect. There are months of paperwork and proposals and counter-proposals. There are days when I wake up at 3 in the morning and lie in the west-facing bedroom of my small apartment and run the numbers in my head and feel the old familiar fear. What if I can't manage? What if I made the wrong decision? What if I am not capable of this? And then I get up and I make tea and I sit at my kitchen table where no one has color-coded my spending and no one is waiting to review my transactions. And I remember, I already did it. I already made the decision, the plan, the account, the lease, the appointment with Rachel, the 40-minute drive to the Scotiabank on a Monday morning when I was shaking so hard I had to sit in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I could go in. I already did all of it. Whatever comes next, I already did all of it. There is a word in the legal language of family violence coercive control that describes what Douglas did in a way that took me a long time to accept applied to my life. Coercive control does not require physical harm. In Canada, the federal government has recognized financial abuse and coercive control as forms of family violence under the Divorce Act since 2021. This means that patterns of financial control, isolation, monitoring, and intimidation are legally relevant in divorce and custody proceedings. You can speak to a family lawyer about this. If cost is a barrier, Legal Aid Ontario provides services to people who qualify. Community Legal Services in London offers free consultations. If any part of this sounds familiar, the monthly reviews, the asking permission, the learning not to spend, the slow forgetting of what your own judgment feels like, I want you to know that it has a name. And it has a name because it is not rare. And it is not rare because it happens to women who are smart, capable, educated, and loved by people who would be horrified to know. The water rises quietly. You can still find dry ground. A woman at Deb's Thursday group said something once that I have thought about on every 3 in the morning night since. She said, "He didn't take my confidence all at once. He borrowed it, a little at a time, until I forgot I'd ever had it. And then I had to take it back, a little at a time, the same way. I am still taking it back. Some mornings it is easier than others. But the window faces west, and the afternoons are getting longer, and there is no one who needs to know where I am going before I put on my coat. That is enough. For right now, that is more than enough."